Welcome to the Know Your Rights Camp podcast. In today's episode, we're going to be discussing war, conflict, and the military-industrial complex. So war, what is it good for, as the song says? I wouldn't say absolutely nothing, and many corporations would disagree with that as well. War is good for lining the pockets of billionaires and corporations through this military-industrial complex. War is good at transferring wealth from the people, from our tax dollars, that would go to our education and social welfare and healthcare programs to these corporations. It's been documented, and presidents have warned us about it. In 1961, in his farewell address, President Eisenhower, a former five-star general, gave a warning to the country about the military-industrial complex. Let's take a listen to it.
We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
So you heard there towards the end of that address, he warned of a grave threat and said it was up to the citizens to really protect us against this threat, this conflation of corporate interests through military contracts, through military defense spending, to create this norm of conflict that we have now today in America. 60 years after this address, the U.S. is comprising 37% of global spending on the military. There are over 200 countries, but we spend almost 40% of what the world spends on the military. And even if you look at the top 10 countries under us, combined, still don't equal what we spend on the military, which last year in 2024 was over $900 billion. And now we're looking at a proposal from the Trump administration for the first time in U.S. history for the U.S. military to spend over $1 trillion, which, by the way, is enough to wipe out student debt in a single year, enough to eliminate our housing crisis with, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people without a place to stay. All of these domestic problems that we have could be eliminated with 1 year of our military spending. So the United States has 37% of global spending. Next is China with 12%. The next is Russia with 5%. Then the rest of the countries are either somewhere between 0 and 3%. So how did we get here? How did we get to this time in this era where the United States is addicted to war? Part of it goes back to the 1930s, where globally there was a recession. And we noticed that different contracts and different spending items actually helped boost the U.S. economy, the defense spending that we're seeing. And that was when you first started seeing these contracts and different things emerge. But ever since then, the U.S. has maintained this global military presence despite there not being a global conflict. And then sometimes putting these global conflicts under, in the earlier days, the war on communism, and then modern days, the war on terror. So although there hasn't been formal war declared, there's been no formal war declared in the United States really since World War II. We've had conflicts that have cost tens of thousands of lives, millions and billions of dollars, like the Korean War, the war in Vietnam, The war in Iraq, both wars, whether it was Desert Storm in the 90s or the war in Iraq and Afghanistan in the 2000s. And these conflicts we're literally still paying for today. So there's different thresholds of conflict, whether it's military intervention, which the U.S. has done in over 100 countries. There's authorized use of military force, which requires more congressional approval and process with legislators. And then there's full-blown war, which, again, hasn't been declared since World War II. So why is it that if we haven't declared war since World War II, there have been so many casualties and so much money spent in conflicts? I mean, just looking since World War II, dozens of countries. So in 1945, we were in China. 1949, in Syria. In Korea, in 1950. In Guatemala, overthrowing the government in 1950. In Tibet in the 1950s up to the 1970s, in Indonesia, in Cuba, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the U.S. helped to murder Patrice Lumumba, the democratically elected president, in the Dominican Republic in the 1960s. Of course, we know the Vietnam War, which was a really bloody war, in Brazil in the 1960s. So the list goes on and on. Greece, Peru, Cambodia, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Turkey. So the U.S. hasn't formally declared war in these countries, in these nations, but there has been intervention and sometimes even switching government regimes. The U.S. expansion, of course, domestically or here on Turtle Island in the United States, began back, in 1619 when the British arrived here. But it started from just those 13 colonies in the Northeast to expanding way westward, with wars in Texas, with the Mexican-American War for California and other states. And basically the U.S. expanded all of that through military force and war as well. However, internationally, wars and conflicts didn't emerge until the late 1890s. One of the first ones was the coup that the United States contributed to in Hawaii to overthrow Queen Liliuokalani. And this was the queen, and this was a completely separate autonomous government that the U.S. sent troops to claim in the 1890s. And now Hawaii is considered a state, right? And similar story in Puerto Rico, where it's considered a territory. But starting in the 1830s in Cuba, the U.S. supported a coup with the dictatorship of Batista, all because of corporate interest in sugar. And that's another trend that you see with war and U.S. military intervention. It's often for corporations or private interests instead of for the interest and security of America and the people. You saw that again in Guatemala, too, where in 1954, the CIA supported a coup and ousted the democratically elected president because his reforms would hurt U.S. companies, specifically United Fruit Company, which was a major U.S. corporation. So that's another leg of the military industrial complex where it works to defend U.S. corporations and interests abroad. But then another primary part of it is the billions of dollars for these multinational and domestic corporations here, whether it's the Lockheed Martin, the Raytheons, and different military contractors that receive billions of dollars of our tax dollars to create planes and bombs and other things that the world uses. So President Eisenhower also issued another warning saying that peace is more than the absence of war. It depends on wise governments as well. And what we see now with the military industrial complex is these corporations that get these defense contracts are actually lobbying, paying millions of dollars to legislators, to politicians, to ensure that these government contracts are renewed, to ensure that when Congress passes a budget and a proposal, it includes significant portions for the military industrial complex. And this is also executed through the executive branch, which we know our president is the commander in chief and has direct access and contact with the military. So the congressional and the legislative branch interact with the executive branch, along with these lobbyists, to create what scholars call this iron triangle, where these different interests are. But nowhere within that interest are the American people or freedom and peace for the U.S. government. And another thing that emerged from the military industrial complex and our wartime economy is this notion of, support our troops. You can't criticize our military because if you do so, you're not supporting our troops. And this country has a long history of anti-war movements that really exploded with the Vietnam War, where you saw even veterans who went to war and fought come back and start groups to say, these human rights violations that we're doing aren't ethical. They're not right. We're not supporting an interest in freedom. People often assume that if the U.S. is engaged in a war, it's to protect freedom or democracy, when there have been time after time to show that that's not actually the case. I think one of the most interesting portrayals of this in pop culture was a film an animation called America World Police from the creators of South Park. And it showed and made fun of this notion of America feeling like they have the authority and responsibility to police the world, to step in when governments don't serve their interests. But the comedy, which was a parody on U.S. foreign policy, just showed throughout this process, the U.S. would bomb, historical things, create lots of casualties in the process, and still nothing would happen. So it was looking at the irony of it. And war is so common in the U.S. and so normalized that we can think of a president like Barack Obama as a peacemaker. And in actuality, yes, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, but he also bombed 7 different countries, right? So President Obama bombed Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Pakistan, Libya, Somalia, and Yemen. And how many of those 7 countries would Dr. King had opposed the bombing of? All 7 of them, right? But he still was able to win a Nobel Peace Prize despite what he did with drones. President Obama is viewed as the president that really took drones off the leash and unlocked them over globally and changed how warfare is. But he was still able to get this Nobel Peace Prize. And also in the process, he gave billions of dollars to allies like Saudi Arabia and Israel to commit war crimes and violate international law. The idea of war crimes is also something that emerged after World War II, where you had all of these heinous atrocities committed. Millions of people died in World War II. And afterwards, you literally had a genocide, right, against the Jewish people that was happening, not just in Germany, but in many countries. So after that, there were different tribunals, and the Geneva Convention came about in 1949 to kind of set some rules of engagement and some guidelines for war. So that's what defined genocide, and that's what defined war crimes on an international level for countries to agree that, hey, okay, we shouldn't target civilians, by the way. We shouldn't target hospitals. We shouldn't bomb schools. So these laws were created in 1949. But we know literally just this week, the government of Israel has been bombing hospitals and schools in Palestine, leading to hundreds of deaths. And they're even bombing people going for relief, looking for food. So people are standing in line to receive rations and in starvation. And that's when they're being targeted to be bombed. According to the 1949 Geneva Convention, these are war crimes. Starving a people is considered crimes against humanity under international law. But unfortunately, there are lots of loopholes, and very powerful governments and allies of the United States and even Russia and what they're doing in Ukraine. And some are saying what Ukraine is doing as well on both sides. You're seeing war crimes that violate international law, but nothing is happening. War and military intervention from the United States often takes the form of the CIA, just one branch of the government acting covertly to overthrow a government. For example, in 1953, the CIA orchestrated a coup to remove Iran's democratically elected prime minister, and who was attempting to nationalize the oil industry. That went against corporate interests in the U.S., and so the CIA intervened and literally overthrew the government. And different things like this repeated throughout history, but also the backlash of these things happened as well. Specifically in Iran, this intervention in 1953 led to the Iranian Revolution in 1979, and then still contributes to the tension that exists today throughout the Middle East, specifically with the U.S. and Iran. I mean, just a few weeks ago, the United States dropped two 30,000-pound bombs in Iran, targeting their nuclear structures and facilities. And these 30,000-pound bombs, which cost millions of dollars to U.S. taxpayers, were dropped with no congressional conversation, no authority, almost a unilateral decision by the Trump administration to drop these bombs, which ultimately weren't that impactful. Attempted to destroy the infrastructure of Iran, the nuclear infrastructure, but actually only set them back a few months. But our lifetimes have been repeatedly plagued by instances like this, where we're bombing Libya, we're bombing Yemen. I believe the past 7 U.S. presidents have all bombed Yemen, yet we've never declared war on the region. So we are used to a wartime. We've normalized wartime in the United States. We've normalized spending more money on war than on Medicare and Medicaid. I mean, in Trump's big, beautiful bill that has this $1 trillion defense spending proposal, it also proposes taking $500 billion away from Medicaid and Medicare and putting millions of Americans in a situation where they don't have care for their own health, yet we're sending bombs internationally all over the world where we don't even want to provide our own citizens with health care. So this military industrial complex we have allows for this, because the lobbyists who represent these defense companies actually have more power and have more influence with presidents and with Congress than the actual American people. So while this big, beautiful bill that's being proposed also proposes cutting Pell Grants by 25%, we want to increase the support of Israel, of Ukraine, and of bombs all over the world. I have a map here that I think it'll be good to show. Like, there's a map I have here that shows U.S. conflicts around the world since 1776, the inception of the United States. And the different colors shading indicates the type of conflict, whether it was, just a major American war or it was just a military conflict. And you see most of the globe is actually shaded in. Hundreds of countries have all been impacted by U.S. foreign policy and U.S. military intervention. So you see here, there's 3 different colors: the darkest red, the lighter red, and then like a pinkish color. And you see almost the entire continent of Africa, for example, is colored with one of the reds, meaning there was a major American war or some other conflict. Much of South America, except Brazil, all of Central America, of course, even Canada, much of Asia, all subjected to U.S. military intervention that proposes to support democracy, but history shows that's not often the case. I mean, look in just what happened in 1970s in Chile, where the U.S. supported the dictatorship of, President Pinochet. In Argentina, also in the 1970s. You see that these conflicts were, today, now in the 2000s, in the 2025, we see the lasting impacts of these conflicts, of these military interventions that wanted to prioritize the land and the resources of the nation for American corporations instead of the people. And you see war happening not just through military intervention, but also through economic sanctions. So technically, the U.S. has been at war with Cuba since the Cold War, since Fidel Castro was there in the Cuban Revolution in the 1950s and 60s. There's been economic sanctions and other things, other policies attempting to cripple the people of Cuba that have had significant impacts that impact their quality of life, their ability to receive, different materials and food and different things. So war can take many forms. So the same year the Geneva Convention was established in 1949, NATO was also established. So the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which currently has over 30 countries admitted, and I believe a few countries have their applications pending. So NATO, which was a big part of the Cold War apparatus, still exists today, but it's also evolving. with most recently President Trump demanding that NATO member organizations go and increase their military spending from 2% of their funds up to 5% of their gross national product. And as I mentioned earlier, very few countries actually spend that much of their money on the military. But what President Trump is demanding of these 30 plus countries is that they more than double the amount that they spend on the military. And this will undoubtedly impact how much they can spend on healthcare, education, and other social programs. It's also helping to normalize the military industrial complex globally, because as these countries double the amount they spend on military, who do you think they buy the bombs from? It's often these multinational American-based corporations, the Lockheed Martins, the Raytheons, the Boeings, and others that are getting billion-dollar contracts to build jets. I believe I just saw the government of the United Kingdom, for example, just spent $2 billion ordering like a couple F-16 fighter jets from the United States because they're nuclear capable. And they're literally billion-dollar planes that we spend our money on here in the United States. And all of that money goes towards corporations. These 30-plus countries have agreed to more than double their military spending from 2% to 5% of their gross domestic product by 2035. And one professor of international relations called this a pathetic spectacle and essentially Trump pressuring them to buy more U.S. weapons. And that's what it translates to. And this professor also called Trump a salesman for the military industrial complex as he goes internationally and meets with Saudi Arabia and other countries. What he's really doing is trying to encourage the sale of arms. Another famous American who received, all right, let me say this like it is. Another famous American warmonger who also received the Nobel Peace Prize was Henry Kissinger. Now, Henry Kissinger, who recently just passed, I believe a few years ago, he received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1973 for helping to broker a ceasefire in Vietnam. However, he literally helped sabotage peace efforts earlier under President Johnson and enabled Nixon to escalate the conflict in Vietnam. And this expanded to Cambodia and Laos and other countries. And Kissinger encouraged what was called the carpet bombing campaign throughout Southeast Asia. And this killed hundreds of thousands of people and destabilized the region and ultimately led to the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, where more than 2 million people were murdered. And I was just in Cambodia 2 months ago observing some of the devastation and the trauma that you still see from this. I visited a high school that during the Khmer Rouge was converted into a death camp, essentially, where almost 20,000 people were murdered. So these are the things that Henry Kissinger supported and enabled, despite his Nobel Peace Prize. So in Chile in 1973, Kissinger helped to engineer a coup that removed the socialist president and replaced him with dictator Augusto Pinochet, and who disappeared thousands of people. So there's this, the standard for being a peacemaker is far too low when we have this normalized wartime economy. And since technically World War II helped to get the globe out of a recession, different governments, not just the United States government, all look to military spending as a way to support their economy. And it's unfortunate because, again, we've entered a state where conflict is normalized and we actually don't want peace. Peace, it's something like the medical industry where the money isn't in the cure, it's in the treatment, right? So a wartime economy, the money isn't in peace treaties, it's in constant and endless war. I mean, think about it. The conflicts in Ukraine and in Israel and Hamas war have been going on for years now. They've been going on for years now, costing billions of dollars to U.S. taxpayers. And it's sort of normalized to where, you know, you don't even, most Americans aren't even speaking out against it anymore. So another thing that impacted the way wars were fought was the 2001 Authorization of Military Force Act that has been used to justify war and intervention in over 20 countries, including Iraq, Afghanistan, and many throughout the Middle East. But we've spent billions, if not over $1 trillion on these conflicts, yet there's been no formal declaration of war, and there's been no extension of safety for the average American. Technically, we here in the United States experience more terrorism domestically from internal conflicts than terrorists attacking us. So with the exception of 9/11, which was a very historic and sort of unprecedented attack on United States soil by terrorists, there have been terrorist attacks and shootings, mass shootings that have killed over 100 people, whether at nightclubs or at country music concerts, at churches, dozens of people slaughtered. These acts of terror that are happening here in the United States, there's actually nothing really being done to confront them. Yet we're still fighting terror internationally, and we're dropping 30,000-pound bombs on countries when we have our own conflicts happening here. So are there positive benefits of the military-industrial complex, or why do people support it so much? And the truth is, a large part of our U.S. military are people of color, right? I believe almost 40% or about 40% of our troops are people of color, and about half of that are black people. I mean, I was just at my boy's retirement from the military in Japan. Well, he was stationed in Japan. He was in the U.S. Navy, and I was just at his retirement last month. And I found out actually the U.S. has over 100 military bases in Japan alone. And I was on his base with hundreds of military men. I'm grateful for them and their time away from their family. So understandably, there are over 2 million active and reserve military personnel in the United States alone. So the military is literally one of the largest employers. And real talk, they got some of the best benefits, man. My boy who just retired at age 41, he's set for a while. And I'm grateful that our tax dollars are going to support things like that. However, imagine if we invested in a domestic initiative where instead of sending our best and brightest internationally to be at bases abroad, we prioritize them to help heal and transform communities here. And I know, we have the Peace Corps and there's the Food Corps and there's AmeriCorps and other like corps that literally just get 1% of the funding that the U.S. military gets. Again, Trump is proposing $1 trillion for the U.S. military. And most of that actually goes directly to contracts to build the jets and to build the bombers instead of to military personnel. You can actually see the Trump administration has been trying to cut benefits and staff at the VA hospitals, at the Veterans Affairs departments and different things, despite saying that he supports our troops. So it's conflicted where you see lots of people of color utilizing the military as a means to get to the middle class, as a means to get out of poverty and different things. But then they themselves are sent to different nations to do different things and come back with trauma. And if you look at our unhoused population and homeless people on the street, veterans are one of the most overrepresented people in the group. You can literally still find people who went to war in Vietnam, over 40 years ago, and are now in the streets homeless with post-traumatic stress disorder, not getting the services they need. And, when they came home from Vietnam, it was called shell shock. They didn't even use words like post-traumatic stress disorder or different things. Or some people came home with addictions, trying to numb the pain from what they did. For the most part, the U.S. government has failed a large part of our veterans who come home with this trauma and need the support. So our military spending isn't even focused on the people. It's focused on the corporations. There's also a role played by the mass media, whether it's film, entertainment, television, even different apps and social media, you're seeing it now, that attempts to normalize the military presence, but also normalize the military-industrial complex. Every other summer, you see some big Hollywood blockbuster film that's either another World War II story or just something that's highlighting the U.S. military. You see it in video games like Call of Duty and others that now it's actually come out that the U.S. military use these video games as recruiting methods to get people to join the military. And it's really normalized killing for young children. You see it in movies and film. Like I was thinking the other day, animation movie I enjoyed as a kid, Toy Story. It's really a love story, a bro story between a cop and a military dude. If you think of Buzz Lightyear of Star Command and Woody, who's like a sheriff, these are two authority figures, right? And that's why people grow up wanting to be police, wanting to be in the military. And but for us as children, when I was 10 years old, it was just sort of normalized that these are the heroes. So whoever they're fighting must be the villains. Whoever the U.S. military is fighting must be the villains. Whoever the police are fighting must be the villains. But in reality, that's not the case. And there's also a really important connection between the military and police that actually, for me, as an anti-war, anti-military person and anti-violence person, connects the two. But I believe it was Huey P. Newton of the Black Panther Party who said the police occupy our community like an invading army, like a military. If you look at how the police are in certain communities, it's similar to how U.S. troops are when they're invading, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan, or a different country. They're standing there with the weapons to preserve safety and different things. And there's a thin line between them. And you see the training tactics used for whether it's a military boot camp or police academy, some of the psychological things that are employed by both of them there's a lot of similarities, but the most one being they both use violence as a way and means to control and intimidate. Violence through the presence of their weapons and guns as a means to enforce what the state wants, and usually to protect the property or the corporate interest. So today we talked about international wars, but let's not forget America's most longest and expensive war is considered the war on drugs that has devastated lives and communities and caused many casualties and caused much trauma as well. So we're not forgetting our war veterans and survivors and warriors from that war as well. But I want to conclude with a quote from a warrior of that war, a famous rapper, poet, and to some prophet, Tupac Shakur, famously said, they got money for war, but can't feed the poor. Our government often spends more money on death and destruction than health, healing, support, education, and basic essential things that a government is supposed to provide to people. And that's problematic. But know that we have the right as the people to challenge this. And this is something that President Eisenhower pointed out in his 1961 address, where he challenged the citizenry, the citizens, us, the people, to check the government when it gets out of hand with the military spending. And that's something we need to do, especially since it's about to top $1 trillion. Thanks for tuning into the Know Your Rights Camp podcast. Be sure to follow us on social media and check us out on knowyourrightscamp.org.